Today I'd like to share with you Chapter 6 of my book. For those of you who have not followed the chapters, my personal story before, it's probably best if you start at Chapter 1. All the chapters are posted. I have not been organized enough to set them as link them all together on my channel, but if you look for Seething Frog and Chapter, you will find them, and you'll find them in order. And that would be the best way for you to get up to speed with what we're doing here. The second thing I'd like to say is I know that this part of it has been very difficult, and at some point it does get better. So that's the whole point of it, but it does take some time. All right, so Chapter 6. Chapter 6, Harbinger. Kate and I pulled into the expansive ranch yard I had known since my earliest memories. As evening closed in, we entered the large looping driveway that passed the coulee, the back of the sandstone house, and Grandma's rose garden up to her back porch. She met us in the kitchen, gray hair framing her elegant countenance. Even in her lavender and pink flowered robe, she commanded one's attention. We shared small talk and then made it into one of the guest rooms behind the library as we headed for bed. Kate had duties with Chad, and the long hours of driving one of Montana's windy, narrow highways had left me exhausted. In the morning, we made our way along the edge of the rims, down to Billings, to the hospital. We were led into a large, empty room dominated by a giant CAT scanner that looked like a waist-high conveyor belt running through a large donut of steel. After a short introduction, our technician asked Kate to place Chad on the conveyor, providing instructions to try to keep him still as still as she could as he progressed through the machinery. Once the tech had settled at his remote computer station, we could hear the whir of the scanner. He reminded Kate about holding Chad still as the process began. When all was ready, Chad began to inch forward into the machine and its giant donut enclosure. When Chad's head had passed through the CAT scanner, the tech stopped the machine and had Kate retrieve Chad. While she was attending to Chad, the tech caught my attention and asked me if I might like to look at the scans. Sure, I responded, as I walked around the desk so I could stand alongside of him. With the CAT scan, we were able to get multiple sequential cross-sections of the skull. He showed me as he clicked through a series of computer images which looked as though they had sliced Chad's head straight across from ear to ear. "Let me see if I can get a good one for us to look at," he said, as he clicked back and forth through the images. "Here's the best image," he said, as we settled in to look at perhaps the most centrally located image of the skull cross-sections. "Interesting," I responded, not knowing what else to say. It was obvious even to my untrained eye that the image showed Chad's scalp, then a ring of skull, and the two cerebellum brain lobes. "What does it mean?" I inquired, trying to learn a little more. "I can't do any kind of diagnosis or X-ray interpretation. You will have to wait for the doctor to provide his assessment. But I guess I can show you a couple things that might be of interest to you." With that, we both moved closer to the screen. He picked up a pen and pointed to the image. "Do you see this? It's the outer skin, and just inside of that is the skull." I nodded in affirmation. "You can see the brain here." He showed me a circled each lobe of Chad's brain. Again, I acknowledged. "Do you see this dark space that forms a ring between the skull and the brain?" he said, hesitantly looking up at me. Again, I nodded, looking first to the wide band of dark inside the skull all around Chad's head. When I looked back at him, he winced slightly. "That's not supposed to be there," he uttered barely audibly. The brain is supposed to be pretty snug against the skull. So Chad's brain is not growing. To my question, he simply turned back to the screen. I stared at the image, feeling myself backing away from the screen as a wave of cognition poured over me. Once I had drunk the image in fully and had regained my equilibrium, I rejoined Kate as she had readied Chad to leave the hospital. For the rest of the day, we wandered Billings and then retreated to the sanctuary of Grandma's old sandstone ranch house. That evening, Kate went to bed with Chad. Grandma and I stayed up late, as we often had. She had never been a morning person, but in the evening, she shined. Grandma sat at her plush high-back chair alongside the massive sandstone fireplace and bookshelves, where she had always spent evenings quietly, alone since Grandpa had died. I pulled a chair up beside her. We talked about the usual nothings, about family for a time. Our conversation flowed easily, as they had since I was 9 or so. Grandma and I had often played cards in the evening, a special bonding time none of my other siblings or cousins had with her. Our favorite game had been a progressive style of rummy with 3 decks and 10 card hands. It took all evening to play a full set of hands. Cards afforded a comforting and natural dialogue flow between us which continued throughout our shared lives. After a time, she asked me how the day had gone. We went to the basement of the hospital where they had a huge new contraption called a CAT scan. The tech told me it had been just introduced, and now in 1976, at the cost of $300,000, Billings had gotten the first one in the state. They had to do extensive training to operate it. "Did you learn anything about Chad?" she asked. I have not shared it with Kate, but I perhaps learned more than I cared to. How so? I shared with Grandma the invitation by the tech to see the images, what I had seen and what, at the end, had become obvious in looking at Chad's shrunken brain. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry." "Yes, I think it's ominous. I had hoped that the sutures of his skull had prematurely fused, thus causing his head not to grow. At least that diagnosis was fixable. If it means what I think it does, what I saw today is not in any way corrective." There was a long, quiet pause in our conversation. I waited. Finally, she leaned back in the chair and again looked at me. "It's a challenge, I know. If that is true, it will not in any way be easy. Parenting is sometimes very rewarding and sometimes very difficult." "I don't know if I have shared with you about losing our son," she asked again, after another pause. "Wasn't Dickie just younger than Marjorie?" "Yes, about a year younger. When he was 7, he came down with a rare disease. It took months to diagnose as he became sicker. I rode the train to Minneapolis with him trying to find a cure or some form of help. In the end, he passed away when he was 9. "That must have been unimaginatively difficult," I offered. "When he died, I went into a deep depression. I'm not sure that even having 2 other children and your grandfather could have ever brought me out of it." "How did you make it through those incredibly sad times?" I asked. "I think what helped me most was that I was already pregnant with your mom when Dickie died in April. She arrived in August. Nurturing her forced me to rejoin the living. I cannot imagine being pregnant with one child while you experience losing another. There were many months, as I recall, when I was overwhelmed. You may not know this. I lost another child, an infant boy who was 6 months old when he came down with pneumonia." "I did not know that. You and Grandpa lost 2 boys?" I said incredulously. "Yes, it has been more than 50 years since I had your mom. I could easily have withdrawn from life when my children died, not knowing my grief, not allowing my grief to steal away the rest of my life was one of the hardest challenges I have ever had. In retrospect, had I allowed myself to withdraw, I would have missed all of the wonderful life experiences I have cherished since then. By the time your grandpa died, I had the wisdom to move through it, to appreciate the lives we had had together, and to continue to live fully. For days thereafter, I processed the events of that day. Most significantly at the time, the profound challenges we were going to have trying to raise Chad. More enduring, even than that, grandmother's wisdom continues to remind me to this day to fully embrace the gift of life, even through monumental hardships. Thanks for watching.